Well, I mean, I'm not making any excuses, okay? I take full responsibility. But let me just tell you how my neck is killing me. My head was pounding, and I just laid down on the ground for an indeterminate amount of time. And then, then I got up and I went and I got some help. I don't know why I didn't call the police. I mean, like, I can't even tell you why I didn't do half the things I should have done. I mean, now that I'm standing right here, there's a lot of things I think I could have done and should have done. I didn't get around to it, and I'll never understand why I didn't. I could, probably because I had such a massive concussion, but just hear me out when I say I'm not making excuses. Yar, you big toad. You nasty pig. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise, and today we're going to keep going in the Ask Not book, this one right here by Maureen Callahan. We're going to keep going with the Mary Jo Kopechne story and the Ted Kennedy story. The last time we ended, we had been talking about Mary Jo's involvement with the family, and she wasn't just this random person that Ted happened to find himself with. She was not somebody who was in any kind of relationship with Ted Kennedy, so any sort of rumor there should have died directly when it was very clear who she was as far as what her job was with the Kennedys. Initially, she had come to Washington, D.C. to work for President Kennedy, but she didn't have the same glamour that he tended to like to surround himself with. She was kind of alienated to George Smathers' office, and she worked for him, but knowing that Smathers and Kennedy were so close, she made her peace with it. But she always kept a picture of RFK on her desk because that was really who she hoped to work for one day. While she really respected John F. Kennedy and all the Kennedys in general, her main objective was to work for RFK. She eventually managed that. She was one of the boiler room girls, and she took all of this information about his candidacy and the run and disseminated it into information that would actually be used and utilized well in order for him to continue to progress forward in his candidacy. And she was very close to him, very close to the whole family. She knew all of his kids, knew his wife, knew, very much a part of the Kennedy machine. She was by no means an outsider. Anyway, the last time we were together, the tragedy of RFK's assassination had just occurred. What is Mary Jo doing with this? I mean, this is an excruciating tragedy for her as well, because she had really believed he was the answer for all that ailed the country. So politically, it's a tragedy, but personally, it's a tragedy. She had greatly admired him, had worked hard to become, part of his inner circle. He knew her well by name. I cannot overstate that this is not somebody who had just recently joined the clan surrounding the Kennedys. This was not somebody who was just sort of on the fringes. This is somebody who was working intimately with the Kennedys in order to progress RFK to the presidency. So, this might not come as any surprise for anybody else, but for me, I remember thinking, wow, that's who she was? Because all the reporting and even Ted Kennedy's description of what had happened distanced her incredibly from who she had been. I had no idea that she was somebody that was this significant to the family. It makes all of this all that more egregious. It would still be egregious if he had treated a stranger in this way. But to treat somebody who had been so close to the family, who had worked relentlessly and tirelessly, who had put her own personal life on the back burner to continue to work for them. Yeah, I mean, she did absolutely idolize RFK. But she wasn't some sycophant who wasn't, contributing significantly to the cause. So anyway, that's where, we come back into the story. He's dead. What's Mary Jo doing with this information? The book says Mary Jo's grief in the wake of RFK's death was even more paralyzing than when JFK had been killed in 1963. She traveled on Bobby's funeral train. She helped pack up his office, a task that, in its enormity and finality, took months. One day, she sat at her desk for hours, staring straight ahead and not moving, not saying a word, leaving her colleagues to ask if she needed help getting home. When all that work was done, Mary Jo Kopechne, rising star, moved away from D.C. She didn't want to be there without Bobby Kennedy. I just feel Bobby's presence everywhere, she said. I can't go back because it'll never be the same again. She still loved politics, but there was no longer a future for her on the Hill. Whom would she work for? Certainly not Ted. He was unserious, the runt of the Kennedy litter, kicked out of Harvard for cheating. He was a sybarite whose sweet, beautiful wife Joan served two purposes for him, as a stay-at-home mother to their 3 young children and as a campaign prop. Mary Jo knew Joan and liked her and thought she was so kind and pretty. Poor Joan. Surely she had heard the stories about Ted's other women. Then again, even Kennedy wives were a bit starstruck by their husbands. Why would Joan be any exception? As it was, everyone thought Mary Jo, too, was worshipful around the Kennedys. Even the family thought so. And this wasn't specific to Mary Jo. They had a phrase they used for their most devoted staffers, honorary Kennedys. Like it was special dispensation to be in their orbit, even more so to be considered one of them. But anyone who wasn't blood would never truly be one of them, no matter how many sacrifices they made, no matter how many injuries to their own egos, their own dignity. It was a lesson their most ardent loyalists would learn for themselves, often in unique and brutish ways. The truth was that most of the Kennedys weren't that special. After Bobby died, their true stars, save Eunice, who had a political mind to rival her brothers, but who, alas, was a woman, were gone. As for the wives, Jackie was the most famous, but she'd shed her widow's weeds, and with Bobby dead, oh, how Jackie loved Bobby. She seemed hell-bent on getting out of the family and out of America. No, power was for the Kennedy men exclusively, and now only Ted was left, the youngest of all Rose and old Joe's children, the son with the least potential. Mary Jo didn't want to work for him or advise him. She certainly didn't want to date him. Now, back to the night of the terrible accident. Martha's Vineyard, June 19th, 1969. The Boiler Room girls, along with some older male Kennedy loyalists, were gathering to mourn Bobby and commemorate all that they had done for him. Mary Jo had been working for another politician and was due in South Carolina, but at the last minute found someone to take her place. She called her mom before heading to the vineyard. She had big news to share, she said. 3 major life decisions she'd just made. First, she'd been offered a job at Matt Reeves Associates, the top political consulting firm in the country. They were doubling her salary to $15,000 a year, and she was taking it. Her career was heading exactly where she wanted it to go. Then Joe picked up the phone in another room, and suddenly the dynamic was off. Whatever else Mary Jo had to confide, her other pieces of news. Was she marrying the man she'd been seeing, the Foreign Service officer that they'd yet to meet? Mary Jo and Owen had broken up before Bobby was assassinated. For Owen, the distance was a hindrance, as was Mary Jo's refusal to have sex. Whatever else Mary Jo had to share, she kept it to herself once her father joined the call. The party at the vineyard that Saturday night was sad all round. Later, when it became the subject of news reports and speculation, much would be made of all these young single girls drinking and carousing with older married men. So many questions as to the character of these women, and Mary Jo especially. Were they drunk? Sleeping with Ted Kennedy or his staff? What was Mary Jo doing? Going off in a car with Ted Kennedy midnight approaching, leaving her handbag and hotel room key behind? What could Ted and Mary Jo possibly have been doing the time that they left the party and the time an eyewitness saw Ted's car heading toward the ferry, an hour and a half later at around 11:20 p.m.? Why was alcohol found in her system? After all, hadn't everyone who'd ever known her said Mary Jo hardly ever drank? Which was it then? Was Mary Jo a perfect Catholic angel or a secret party girl with a Kennedy fixation? Ted said she had asked to leave with him, so clearly she was after one thing, right? And when the detail somehow leaked that Mary Jo's body was found without underwear, well, didn't that say it all? No matter that tests for sperm came back negative. All these contradictions led the Massachusetts Southern District Attorney Edmund Dennis to request, in August of 1969, an exhumation of Mary Jo's body for an autopsy. Mary Jo's mother was horrified. "I don't want my baby girl's body dug up," she said. "My tiny, lovely baby." Mary Jo was left in the water for 9 hours, she said. She didn't belong there. Okay, let's go back to some of these questions that people are asking. Let's just have some speculation about this, okay? I feel like Mary Jo had consistently shown that she was committed to the virtues that her church had taught her, that she was not willing to throw away the value of sex belonging to marriage, that she was not a hard drinker, that she had always had a goal in mind about what needed to be done in life, that she was very one-track mind as far as like her career. I think that she had always shown herself to be a person who was above reproach as far as her moral code stated she should be. With that being said, I think that these events you know, losing this sort of North Star that had guided her whole life as far as like her political career, losing RFK, losing the momentum that had been carrying all of them. Everything's just gone all of a sudden. All of her aspirations have been gutted. I feel like it stands to reason that this is not a person who said she didn't drink. She just rarely drank. But if you're all getting together to commemorate and commiserate and to be sad, I think that it makes perfect sense that even if you were like a strict non-drinker mostly, your grief might lend you to be like, yeah, why don't I just have a drink? Like I want to feel different. I want to feel better. You know, maybe this will just at least put a Band-Aid over how I feel tonight. Because it would have been a sad gathering. So I'm not surprised that there was alcohol in her system. I mean, that kind of event, you might loosen up on some of your strictures. What is this poor childish thinking that it has to be one or it's either she drank or she didn't drink? Or is it possible that sometimes she drank? People said she rarely drank, which means that she's not opposed to it. She's not like some teetotaler, you know? Now, and the other thing too, it is weird about the handbag and the hotel room key. Her leaving that behind and getting in a car with Ted Kennedy. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Except for, as we'll discuss later in this chapter, she'd been complaining about having a headache. And the house was kind of loud and the party was going. And so in order to find some peace and quiet, she had crawled in the back seat of Ted Kennedy's car to lay down and rest her head. And if that were the case, it would make sense why her handbag and stuff were left. Because if Ted got in the car and didn't know she was in the back seat and like took off, well, of course she didn't have her stuff with her. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. I mean, not in great detail, but they do bring that idea up. So that could be why her handbag and hotel key had been left behind. And then the final thing I want to talk about is this ridiculousness that her not having underwear on meant that she had been like up to no good. Oh, maybe she hadn't packed enough underwear, which isn't that all our greatest fear? That's why all of us pack like 24 pair of underwear when we're going to go, you know, stay somewhere for one night. You can't run out. She was wearing pants. And so it's not like she was wearing a dress with no underwear. If, and this is just completely me speculating, but say like she'd been like, oh crap, I didn't pack enough underwear. Well, I'm going to wear these pants tonight. You know, because, you know, then what's the difference if you're wearing underwear or not? It's all covered. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's just not a piece of evidence. Because somebody wasn't wearing underwear. For all we know, like, maybe she didn't like wearing underwear. You know, maybe she didn't want the panty lines. Who knows? But that's got nothing to do with somebody's sexual morals suddenly lapsing because they didn't put underwear on. But they had pants on. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so those are all my little caveats for that passage. Continuing. Ted had been drinking the afternoon of the crash, sailing in a regatta. That evening he had taken a bath, had his fourth rum and coke, and then began his way over to the small two-bedroom rented cottage in Chappaquiddick, where this gathering was in effect, the mourners drinking and smoking cigarettes in this Spartan, dingy house. The grill was so tiny that everyone settled for sausages and cheese hors d'oeuvres. There wasn't even any music. One of the girls had to venture into town to find a radio. Really, it was a bunch of sad middle-aged men moping around and drinking heavily. Hardly the kind of great affair one would associate with the Kennedys. But to Ted, as always, a party was a party. And a pretty young blonde was just another pretty young blonde, like this one, who had asked for a ride back to the inn. Or had she? That was Ted's testimony at the inquest on January 5th, 1970. He said, "She indicated to me that she was desirous of leaving if I would be kind enough to drop her back at her hotel." Mary Jo's close friends doubted that. They thought it far more likely that Mary Jo, who had said she'd felt queasy from too much sun that day, went into the back seat of the black Oldsmobile to nap, and that Ted, drunk and unaware that she was in the car, took off. That, they said, was a more likely explanation as to why her handbag and hotel room key were left behind. Mary Jo, a stickler for detail, had not intended to leave. And again, maybe Mary Jo had asked for that ride. The last ferry from Chappie to Edgartown left at midnight. Maybe she looked round and saw that no one else was in the mood to leave and hadn't wanted to crash on a hard, dirty floor. Maybe in her haste she simply forgot her bag and key, and those could easily be removed the next day. The front desk would surely give her a spare. And who better to hitch a ride with than Ted, who knew the island so well? It could be confusing and scary at night. Few street lamps, unpaved roads, no lit signs. No way to know where you were going, really, unless you really knew where you were going. On the way back to the ferry that night, Ted was going way over the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit, down Chappaquiddick Road before veering into a dirt path called Dyke Bridge Road. It was rough and narrow, a road to nowhere. Ted was gunning the car so fast that by the time he felt the road give way beneath him, tires rolling over the plank wood bridge, no guardrail on either side, He had steered his black Oldsmobile Delmont 88 off the right side and plunged into the water, where the car landed upside down. The force of impact caved in the windshield. At the inquest, Ted detailed the moment before losing control. He put Mary Jo in the passenger seat. I recall the movement of Mary Jo next to me, the struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me, and I, at that time, opened my eyes and I realized I was upside down. The water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black, and I was able to get a half gulp, I would say, of air before I became completely immersed in the water. I realized that Mary Jo and I had to get out of the car. I can remember the last sensation of being completely out of air and inhaling what must have been half a lung full of water and assuming that I was going to drown. And the full realization that no one was going to be looking for us until the next morning, that I wasn't going to get out of that car alive, and then somehow coming up to the last energy of just pushing, pressing and coming up to the surface. I have no idea in the world how I got out of that car. Mary Jo was still alive. If Ted, strapping athletic, 6'2", an excellent swimmer, could get himself out, surely he could rescue Mary Jo. He tried, he said. The water only came up to his waist, and he said he dove again and again. I was doing everything possible that I could to get the girl out of the car, Ted said. The girl, the blonde. The next day's headlines. Teddy escapes, blonde drowns. Those words were buried under the top story. JFK's dream realized. The front pages of every newspaper in America with astonishing images. Men walk on moon. The American flag had been planted. All the astronauts survived. The country was turning toward futurism again, and hope. What was Bran Kennedy if not those very things? If Ted could tap into the regret felt for Jack and Bobby, could lean into his promise as the last Kennedy brother and the bridge, as it were, to a new decade, well, maybe he had a good shot at getting out of this. Better than good, actually. Okay, let's just regroup, shall we? He says that he barely survived. Car's upside down. He's gulping for air. You know, he doesn't even know how he got out. But then he says that when he stood up, he was in waist-deep water. Was the struggle to get out of the vehicle, is that what the struggle was? Because surely strapping 6'2" Ted Kennedy, excellent swimmer, should not have been struggling so profoundly in waist-deep water. You would think. So it must have been, but he doesn't talk about how it was hard to get out of the car. He keeps talking about how, like, I don't know how I broke through the surface. I do. You stood up. Anyway, Ted said that he gave up and floated the 50 or so feet to shore, then rested for about 20 minutes before jumping back into Puka Pond. Not to rescue Mary Jo, still struggling to breathe, but to swim the length of 2.5 football fields through a tide he later called brutal back to shore. Once there, he passed several cottages, their lights still on, and ran all the way back to the party house. There he stood, dripping wet, issuing one command. Get me Markham! This was Senator Paul Markham, a former U.S. prosecutor from Massachusetts. He was Ted's other fixer. Ted's cousin, Joey Gargan, was also summoned. There's been a terrible accident, Joe said. The car's gone off the bridge down by the beach and Mary Jo's in it. The three men piled into a Plymouth Valiant parked outside and raced to the scene. Gargan and Markham stripped down and went into the pond while Ted stood on the bridge and watched as they tried to save Mary Jo. But they weren't trained first responders. They had no idea how to execute a water rescue. Oh my God, Ted said, looking up at the night sky. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? Okay. As we're reading this, I'm thinking to myself, how did he know Mary Jo was in the car if Mary Jo had fallen asleep in the back seat? Like, at what point was he aware that she was there? So that is the one question mark I have on that particular story. That one, to me, makes the most sense as to why she was in his car in the first place, because it's not like they had anything going. Why would she ask him for a ride back to the hotel room, but then leave her purse and keys? I mean, that just does not make sense to me. No woman's going to leave her purse and keys when she's going to go back to the hotel room and she's got to be somewhere the next day. You would have to be, like, super drunk to make that move. And there doesn't seem to be any indication that that's where she was at. They said there was alcohol in her system. They didn't say that she was incapacitated with alcohol. So I find it interesting that he knew she was there. But can we just, all that to the side, what the heck are we reading right now where it says that he floats to shore, which was only 50 feet away? But then why did he jump back in to swim to the opposite shore? Why didn't he just cross the bridge that was, like, literally right there? Like, if he's on one side of the shore, because that's kind of where they went off, wouldn't you climb out and just cross the bridge on foot? Why are we swimming across the pond? And what kind of a pond has a tide? Is it just called a pond? Like, I don't understand what I'm reading right now. All right, well, somehow, even though his head was throbbing and he was hopelessly exhausted, as he says, he was able to swim 2.5 football fields, then run all the way back to the cottage for help. Meanwhile, passing multiple houses with lights on. Any normal person, first of all, would have crossed that bridge on foot. Maybe I'm just not understanding what the text is saying, because it literally does not make sense that he floated 50 feet to shore and then decided to swim across a pond that literally had a bridge that extended over it. I don't get that. Then compound the fact that he ran back to the cottage, even though he was hopelessly exhausted, passing multiple lit houses. Somebody's drowning and dying. And you gotta get back to that party. That's where my friends are. Well, my mind is blown. Like, are you guys, like, as just shocked as I am? I don't understand anything that his testimony has said so far. Okay, well, against the advice of the smartest Kennedy advisors, current and former, Ted decided to deliver an emergency televised address 1 week after the crash. For most of these men, it was a real reckoning with the Kennedys. To a one, they had been repulsed that Ted asked why he couldn't say Mary Jo had been driving that night. JFK's most venerated speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, wrote Ted's address to the nation, and it went in part this way. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. Don't say that. Although my doctors inform me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or on anyone else. Yeah, well, you say that, but you literally just told me in the previous paragraph that I was exhausted from trying to save Mary Jo, and that through the exhaustion and alarm, that's why I couldn't manage it, and I have no idea what I was up to. But I'm not trying to, like, find an excuse, you guys. Don't hear the excuse I just gave you. I'm not making excuses, except for the one I just said. He says, I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately. Yeah. I mean, what are you going to say about that? Instead of looking directly for a telephone after lying exhausted in the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held and requested the help of 2 friends, my cousin Joseph Garrigan and Paul Markham, and directed them to return immediately to the scene with me. This was sometime after midnight, in order to undertake a new effort to dive down and locate Miss Kopechne. Their strenuous efforts, undertaken at some risk to their own lives, also proved futile. All kinds of scrambled thoughts, all of them confused, some of them irrational, many of them which I cannot recall, and some of which I would not have seriously entertained under normal circumstances. Remember, I'm not making an excuse. A lot of things went through my mind during this period. They were reflected in various inexplicable, inconsistent, and inconclusive things I said and did, including such questions as whether the girl might still be alive somewhere out of that immediate area, whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys, whether there was some justifiable reason for me to doubt what had happened and to delay my report, whether somehow the awful weight of this incredible incident might in some way pass from my shoulders. Today, as I mentioned, I feel morally obligated to plead guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. No words on my part can possibly express the terrible pain and suffering I feel over the tragic incident. This last week has been an agonizing one for me and for the members of my family. Nobody cares about you and your family, you stupid doofus. Somebody's dead because you are running around trying to save your own ass instead of saving the person who is literally drowning. Why would you get out on shore and lie there for an undetermined amount of time? Moreover, why would you then jump into the water and swim 2.5 football lengths in a pond when there's a bridge? And why would you pass all these houses? And why wouldn't you call the police? If you had done absolutely nothing wrong, you could have picked up any telephone anywhere and been like, I need help right now. But you couldn't because you're drunk as a skunk. So it's like, what's the greater tragedy? That the police find out that a Kennedy was behind the wheel drinking? You're going to get a pass on that anyway. Or somebody dies. The police weren't going to come after you for having been drinking and driving and crashing your car. You're Kennedy on Martha's Vineyard. You probably light the whole island on fire and they'd be like, those Kennedys like to get up to some stuff. You know, there wouldn't have been any consequences for you. What were you really afraid that they would find out about you? I truly do not understand what he was thinking. He literally would not have gotten in trouble for it. But now someone's dead. I mean, how drunk was he that this is how he was making decisions? Was there drugs involved? Like, what had happened to his mental faculties? I don't know. At the inquest, John Ferrer, the diver who recovered Mary Jo's body the next afternoon, testified that Mary Jo had not drowned, but had suffocated to death. He said she had been alive for at least an hour in the water, maybe longer. That didn't matter to Ted. He was sticking to his story. Was there any particular reason? Prosecutor Edmund Dennis asked Ted why you did not call either the police or the fire department. Well, Ted testified, I intended to call for assistance and report the accident to police within a few short moments of going back into the car. Well, did anything transpire to prevent that? Ted dodged the question. Instead, he became more talkative about his own physical pain, self-pity, fear, and a childlike belief that the whole problem, Mary Jo's death and his responsibility for it, would just go away. What? What? You just killed someone and you just think it's going to go away? Like, this is truly a person who's had everything just handed to them in life. That you could literally run a car off a bridge. Somebody's drowning and you're like, I don't know, it'll fix itself, I guess. When he was giving that testimony, did he expect the listeners of this to be like, aw, Teddy, aw, poor baby. Was it really scary for you? Oh, poor thing. Like, if I had heard a grown man say, oh, I just had this childlike belief that it would all go away, I would have wanted to slap him across the face. Wake up! Are you crazy? Why would this just go away? I mean, in his defense, has he ever had to be held account to anything in his whole life? But it seems like once you kill somebody, there's only so much protection other people can give you. Right? Like, surely even he could have suspected there were limits to what the fixers could do. Well, he said that he was afraid to call Mary Jo's mother. Yeah, well, he should have been. I just couldn't gain the strength within me, the moral strength to call Mrs. Kopechne at 2 o'clock in the morning and tell her that her daughter was dead. Instead, he called Helga Wagner. Then he went back to his room at the inn, and despite being seen by multiple witnesses at breakfast the next morning, freshly showered, shaven, neatly dressed, composed with a healthy appetite, Ted insisted he'd not slept the night before, tossing and turning and pacing and overwhelmed by the tragedy and loss of a very devoted friend, whose last name he was unsure of and whom he had left at the bottom of a pond. I mean, this is like the darkest comedy I've ever read. And it's not comedic. I apologize, because really, somebody died here. But the lengths to which this fool has gone to condone what he has done, to plaster over his poor choices, to claim he's not making excuses as multiple excuses tumble from his mouth. I have to laugh, because if this was like a Mighty Python skit, it could not be funnier. Unfortunately, this is real life. And someone really thought they could get away with all of this. And somebody really thought these were acceptable excuses, that this was a appropriate way to conduct himself, to communicate the accident, to suggest to you that, you know, this is really bad, but, you know, like, can you imagine my trauma and how scared I was? Put yourself in my shoes. It was really scary. It's like, you jackass, what is wrong with you? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the crash, Bobby's widow, Ethel, was deputized to call Mary Jo's parents. Ethel told them, as a recent widow and fellow Catholic who had welcomed Mary Jo into her and Bobby's home many times, that she knew loss, that faith was a comfort, and that, rest assured, the Kennedys would be attending Mary Jo's funeral. Okay. Can you imagine being Ethel and being like, okay, just a minute, you guys. Can I just remind you that my husband was shot? He is dead. And Ted running off a bridge with Mary Jo in the back of the car is not my responsibility. Y'all better wake Ted up, somebody grab him by the scruff of the neck, slam him in a chair, and give him a phone. Because that's not my responsibility. I'm not calling Mary Jo's family. Not at all. And you people over here telling me how it's going to be that, jump in, help a Kennedy in crisis, get a brain in your heads. Okay, what are you talking about that I got to call Mary Jo's parents? How is this my responsibility? Excuse me while I go comfort my grieving children whose dad was shot to death. Okay, I would just be livid if I was Ethel. On June 22nd, 1969, hundreds gathered to watch Mary Jo's funeral procession in Plymouth, Pennsylvania. In Catholic tradition, hers was an open casket. Mary Jo was dressed in a long blue gown, reminiscent of the Virgin Mary. A rosary was laced between her hands. In the front pew sat Ted, wearing a neck brace he did not need. So the mockery of that, the theatrics, the dramatic neck brace, I can't manage without it because, after all, I struggled so hard to get Mary Jo out of the car. You've got to be kidding me. He literally wore a neck brace he didn't need? Like, the insult of that. Anyway, Joan and Ethel Kennedy sat with Ted. Joan had been told by her doctors not to fly, that her pregnancy was too fragile, but she defied them. What would the press think if she didn't go? Her absence would only fuel the rumors that Ted was having sex with Mary Jo, or had planned to that night. Yet Mary Jo in American media was still nameless. She was the victim drawn to politics, the girl in Ted Kennedy's car, the blonde who drowned, the inexpendable woman whose death made Ted a man, yet might keep him from becoming the president. The New York Times literally said that the death of Mary Jo Kopechne was what had made Ted Kennedy a man. Don't think it did, because he was still over there going, I thought I could just shrug off the fact that somebody had died in my car. I call it childish. I don't know. Was that the making of a man, New York Times? Ted had promised to tell Jo and Gwen Kopechne what happened that night, when he was ready. Oh, when he's ready. Okay, well, that'll be never. Her parents were dissuaded from exhuming Mary Jo's body, and from suing Ted Kennedy, afraid of what it would do to all the reputations. As the years passed with no explanation or answers and no justice for their daughter, Gwen began self-medicating with Valium. Her father, who kept all his anguish bottled up, eventually developed stomach cancer. They spent their lives tending to Mary Jo's grave and her memory while fielding calls from Ted Kennedy every few years, asking them to quietly support his latest election bid. Can you fathom a world in which some buffoon kills your daughter in a car accident, leaving her to drown in 3 feet of water, and then has the audacity to phone you up every couple of years and be like, don't forget to vote for me? If I'd been Mary Jo's dad, I would not have died of stomach cancer. I would have died in a brutal fight to the death with Ted Kennedy. These parents, were they so iced in by their grief that they could not identify the audacious things that the Kennedys are doing to them over and over and over again? Do they think that because it's a Kennedy that is saying these things that they have no rights whatsoever to rise up in indignation and fury at what is happening? I just can't even understand why in the world they let the Kennedys treat them like this. But I think their grief was just so great. And to make it all worse, Ted kept telling them, I'm going to tell you guys what happened. Just let me get, I have to be ready for that story. So just hang tight. Never got around to it. The book says the Boiler Room girls refused to talk to Gwen and Jo about Mary Jo's last weekend alive, or what they saw and heard in the aftermath. None told Mary Jo's parents why some of them remembered seeing her leave the party that night at different times, or not at all, only to recall in official testimony one by one seeing Mary Jo leave between 11 and 11:15 that night. No other media outlet picked up on the explosive report in the Washington Post by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, fresh off of Watergate, that the surviving Boiler Room girls may have been targets of blackmail, possibly by Ted's enemies. The expose focused on a New York City apartment rented by a former White House secret investigator, which he claimed was for establishing a private detective office to conduct confidential investigations. However, the article read, sources said that the apartment was furnished with velvet wallpaper and fur rugs, hardly the decor for a private detective agency. Government attorneys have been told that the apartment was to be used to seduce female friends of the late Mary Jo Kopechne. The scheme involved hiring a good-looking man to seduce the women in the apartment, have pictures taken secretly, and then blackmail the women into revealing secrets about Miss Kopechne and the party that took place shortly before the Chappaquiddick accident. What, if anything, resulted from that scheme? That sounds right on brand for Washington, D.C. For their silence, the Boiler Room Girls were rewarded with Ted Kennedy's contempt. Years later, Mary Jo's roommate, fellow Boiler Room girl Nance Lyon, said Ted never spoke to her professionally because she was a girl, and once claimed that it was Nance, not Ted, who wanted to say Mary Jo was driving the car that night. Not that any of it mattered. Ted had been protected from the beginning. The judge presiding over Ted's hearing, in which he pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, was a longtime Kennedy family friend. Oh gosh, Ted's crisis managers had all worked and written speeches for Jack and Bobby. The bulk of the on-scene reporters were men. Well, that's not really a reason why things went haywire. I mean, that's stupid. A man can be just as horrified at the death of a woman drowned in a car as a woman reporter would be. So, scratch that, Maureen. Anyway, the first historian of Chappaquiddick, Jack Olson, whose book was published 2 days before the inquest began in January 1969, was secure in his book's premise. What had Mary Jo been doing with Senator Ted Kennedy that night? The obvious question was that they were playing around in the weeds, Olson said. She's had a few drinks, she's very giddy and excited, she's with a Kennedy, lifelong dream. He's probably been loving her up a little, Olson continued, just to be in the car with him in the middle of the night on a deserted island. She must have been beside herself with excitement, a spinster girl. What was she, 28? Mary Jo had been a week away from turning 29. In the Kennedy version, Mary Jo died, a temptress, a seductress, a slut, and a groupie. In all likelihood, she died a virgin. That's the end of that story about Mary Jo Kopechne and the disgusting pig that is Ted Kennedy. Can you believe that? With that Owens guy who wrote a book and was like, sad spinster girl just playing around with the weeds. Ted's kind of like throwing her a bone. Poor, pathetic, sad, disgusting person. Like, I can't even believe a book like that was ever written. But, I mean, then again, you know, scum comes in many forms. You know what I mean? Like, this is a book right here that has been written by a woman to disdain men. And in her own way, she's doing the same thing that Owen did. But that's neither here nor there. I want to talk about what we do know. And what we do know is that this is a horrific story. But made all the more horrific by the fact that there are people who were all around the Kennedys who were such sycophants that they were willing to work hand in glove with this demon who had just driven somebody off of the bridge. And everyone's like, I want the Kennedys to like me. What do you need me to do? Okay, I'll say anything you want me to say. Why? What? Who cares what the Kennedys think? Who cares at all? What was it about them that was just like, you know, I'll sacrifice my firstborn on the altar of Kennedy. Anything you say. You know, it's wild to me. Wild to me that anyone want to give the Kennedys a pass, and particularly Ted Kennedy a pass. That sad apology that he made, that like literally, I can't believe anybody who had a brain in their head wrote that. You know, the fact, I mean, like if somebody told me that Ted had written that himself, I'd be like, well, that tracks. He had somebody write that for him. The whole thing about, well, you know, I mean, I'm not making any excuses, okay? I take full responsibility. But let me just tell you how my neck is killing me. My head was pounding, and I just laid down on the ground for an indeterminate amount of time. And then, you know, then I got up and I went and I got some help. I don't know why I didn't call the police. I mean, like, I can't even tell you why I didn't do half the things I should have done. I mean, now that I'm standing right here, there's a lot of things I think I could have done and should have done. I didn't get around to it, and I'll never understand why I didn't. I could, probably because I had such a massive concussion. But just hear me out when I say I'm not making excuses. Yar, you big toad. You nasty pig. How Ted Kennedy was just bounced and trounced right out of Washington, D.C. is as a testimony to how sick everybody in Washington, D.C. is. That somebody, one of their own, could be up in here rolling girls right into the water, drowning them, and just being like, well, I mean, you know, we all make mistakes. So, anyway, that's the end of that story. A little fired up, a little annoyed, a little roasted and toasted over that story because I just cannot even believe that anybody could be so egregious in the way that they behaved. And then continue on in a successful career. All because, well, don't we just love our Kennedys? Camelot after all. What a sick country we live in. That this family became what we called our royalty. Sad day in the morn. Anyway, I will see you guys later in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. I so appreciate your support. Talk to you later. Bye.